Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where stories unfold like mist across ancient stones. Tonight, we embark together on a journey into shadow and lamplight, into the heart of London's most mysterious corners, where the great detective Sherlock Holmes awaits us by his fireside, if Sherlock Holmes awaits us by his fireside. This is a story designed to slow your racing thoughts, to let your mind drift peacefully through cobblestone streets and moonlit gardens, to carry you gently into the realm of sleep. There is no hurry here, no urgency, only the soft patter of rain against windows, the warm glow of gaslight, and the promise of a mystery that unfolds with the gentle patience of falling snow. Before we begin our tale proper, I wonder, where do you find yourself tonight? Perhaps you are nestled in your own comfortable space, far from Victorian London, in some distant corner of the world, where the hour grows late, or perhaps has only just begun. Wherever you are, whatever time shows on your clock, you are welcome here. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling for 3 days without cease, drumming its endless melody against the windows of 221B Baker Street. It was the kind of rain that London does so well, soft and persistent, turning the cobblestones to mirrors and filling the air with the clean mineral scent of wet stone. Inside, the fire burned low and steady in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the familiar sitting room, where Sherlock Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. I, Dr. John Watson, had been watching him for the better part of an hour, noting the telltale signs of a mind unoccupied. It was perhaps the most dangerous state for my friend, this restless quietude, when the lack of intellectual stimulus threatened to drive him toward darker remedies. The evening papers lay untouched beside his chair. His violin rested against the wall, its bow gathering dust. Even his pipe, that constant companion, sat cold and forgotten on the side table. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly, marking the passing moments with gentle insistence. 9:15. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels splashing through puddles, the sound muffled and distant through the rain-washed glass. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence like a stone dropped into still water. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question was so unexpected, so unlike my rational friend, that I set down my medical journal and regarded him with some concern. "I believe," I said carefully, "in what can be observed and measured. Why do you ask?" Holmes rose from his chair with that peculiar feline grace he possessed, crossing to the window where he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the rain trace silver rivers down the glass. "A most curious letter arrived this afternoon while you were at your club, from a Reverend Thomas Blackwood, vicar of St. Bartholomew's in Highgate. He writes of strange occurrences in his churchyard, manifestations that have the entire parish in a state of considerable agitation." "Manifestations," I echoed, joining him at the window. The street below was nearly deserted, the gas lamps creating pools of golden light in the gathering darkness. "Lights, Watson, mysterious lights, moving among the tombstones at midnight, the sound of singing where no singers should be, and most curiously, fresh flowers appearing each morning on a grave that has lain untended for 20 years. Holmes turned to face me, and I was pleased to see a spark of interest kindling in those remarkable eyes. The locals speak of the ghost of Eleanor Ashworth, a young woman who died under circumstances that were never fully explained. They say she walks the cemetery paths, searching for something, though what that might be, none can say. Orchestrating atmospheric scene shifts and sensory immersion. Ative shifts. Before I could respond, a gentle knock sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a tray laden with tea things. The familiar ritual unfolded with comforting predictability. The soft clink of china, the whisper of hot water being poured, the delicate perfume of Earl Grey rising in fragrant clouds. She set the tray on the low table between our chairs, adjusted the position of the sugar bowl with the practiced precision of long habit, and departed with barely a sound, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click. The Reverend arrives at 10:30, Holmes continued, settling back into his chair and reaching for his cup. He was most insistent that he speak with me in person. Apparently, the situation has escalated. Last night, it seems, one of the parishioners claims to have seen a figure in white standing beside the Ashworth grave, clearly visible in the moonlight despite the late hour and the impropriety of such a vigil. I added milk to my own tea, watching the white swirl and blend into brown, a small, mesmerizing dance of fluid dynamics. Could it not simply be someone playing a prank, or perhaps someone with a legitimate reason to visit the grave at night? Perhaps, Holmes conceded, taking a slow sip of his tea. But the Reverend mentions certain details in his letter that suggest something more complex at work. The flowers, for instance, are always white roses, and they appear regardless of season. In winter, when no roses bloom in all of England, there they are, fresh as morning dew. And the singing, Watson. He describes it as unlike any hymn or song he has ever heard. A melody that seems to drift on the wind itself, sourceless and strange. The fire needed attending, and I rose to add another log from the brass scuttle, enjoying the simple physicality of the task. The new wood caught quickly, sending up a shower of sparks and filling the room with the sweet scent of burning oak. The warmth reached out from the hearth, wrapping around us like a comfortable blanket. "You are intrigued," I observed, returning to my chair. "Intrigued, yes," Holmes admitted. "But more than that, Watson, I am curious. The human mind is endlessly fascinating in its capacity for self-deception, for seeing patterns where none exist, for constructing elaborate narratives to explain the inexplicable. If this is merely a case of mass hysteria, it will be interesting to trace the origin and progression of the delusion. If, however, there is something more tangible at work, some human agency behind these supernatural appearances, then the question becomes, why? What purpose is served by creating the appearance of a haunting? We sat in companionable silence for a time, sipping our tea and listening to the rain. The room had taken on that particular quality of coziness that only rainy evenings can provide, a sense of being insulated from the world, warm and dry, while the weather spent its fury against the windows. The gas lamps burned steadily, their soft light supplementing the fireplace's glow, creating an atmosphere of almost drowsy comfort. At precisely 10:30, the bell rang below, its sound carrying clearly up the 17 steps to our sitting room. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hall, muffled voices, and then the tread of unfamiliar feet ascending the stairs. Holmes had already arranged himself in his chair, adopting that air of focused attention that characterized his professional demeanor. The man who entered was perhaps 50 years of age, tall and spare, with the perpetually worried expression that seemed common to men of the clergy. His clothes were well made, but had seen better days, and his boots were muddy, despite the evident care he had taken to clean them. He carried his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as Mrs. Hudson announced him and departed. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Oxford, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude that you have agreed to see me. This matter has become quite desperate, I fear. The parish is in an uproar, and I confess I am at my wits' end." "Please, Reverend Blackwood, be seated." Holmes indicated the chair opposite his own. "Watson, would you be so kind as to pour the Reverend some tea? He looks as though he could use it." Indeed, the man did appear quite distressed, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the cup I offered. He took a long sip, closing his eyes briefly, and some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. "Now then," Holmes continued, his voice gentle, almost hypnotic in its calmness, "tell me everything. Begin with Eleanor Ashworth herself. Who was she, and how did she die?" The Reverend set down his teacup with a soft click against the saucer, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice had taken on the quality of someone recounting a story told many times, yet one that never lost its power to disturb. Eleanor Ashworth was 19 years old when she died, 20 years ago this very month. She was the daughter of Sir Richard Ashworth, a baronet whose estate bordered the church grounds. Beautiful by all accounts, accomplished, educated far beyond what was common for young ladies of her time. She had studied botany and could identify any plant that grew in England. She painted, played the pianoforte beautifully, and had a particular fondness for roses, white roses specifically. The rain intensified momentarily, a sudden drumming against the windows that made us all pause and listen. Then it settled back into its earlier rhythm, a steady background accompaniment to the Reverend's tale. She was found one morning at the base of Highgate Hill, not far from the cemetery gates. Her neck was broken, the apparent result of a fall. The inquest ruled it an accident, though there were whispers, as there always are in such cases. Some said she had been sleepwalking, a condition from which she reportedly suffered. Others suggested darker possibilities. Her father was devastated, withdrew completely from society, and died himself less than a year later. The estate passed to a distant cousin who never visits. Eleanor was buried in the family plot, a magnificent tomb of white marble with an angel standing guard, and for nearly 2 decades, no one paid the grave any particular attention. Holmes had been listening with his eyes half closed, his fingers still steepled, processing every word. And when did the disturbances begin? 6 weeks ago, almost to the day, the Reverend replied. One of the groundskeepers, old Thomas Finch, arrived one morning to find fresh white roses laid upon the grave. He thought perhaps some relative had placed them there, though he could not recall seeing anyone. The next morning, more roses, and the morning after that. It has continued every day since, without fail. A coal shifted in the fireplace, settling deeper into the grate with a soft sound. The clock chimed the 3/4 hour, its notes clear and sweet in the warm room. "And the lights? The singing?" I prompted, finding myself drawn into the mystery despite my skepticism. The lights were first observed 2 weeks after the roses began appearing. Our sexton, a practical man not given to fancy, was locking the church late one evening when he saw them, pale blue lights drifting between the tombstones like will-o'-the-wisps. He watched for nearly 10 minutes before they faded away. Since then, several parishioners have reported similar sightings, always around midnight, always in the vicinity of the Ashworth tomb. As for the singing, the Reverend paused, seeming to search for the right words. It is unlike anything I have ever heard. Not a hymn, not a folk song, but something that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. A melody that haunts the listener long after it has ceased. The story hung in the air between us, laden with mystery and the promise of answers yet to be discovered. Outside, London slept beneath its blanket of rain, while here, in this warm room with its gentle firelight and comfortable shadows, we contemplated the strange tale of Eleanor Ashworth and her moonlit vigil in the cemetery of St. Bartholomew's. Before you fall asleep tonight, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. Holmes opened his eyes fully and fixed the Reverend with his penetrating gaze. And the figure seen last night? Yes, Mary Patterson, one of our most reliable parishioners, was returning late from tending to her sister, who lives near the church. She took a shortcut through the cemetery, a path she has walked 1,000 times. As she passed the Ashworth tomb, she saw, standing clear as day in the moonlight, despite the hour approaching midnight, a woman in a white dress, her face turned toward the angel monument. Mary said the woman seemed to be reaching out toward the marble, as if trying to touch something just beyond her grasp. Then, in an instant, she vanished, simply ceased to be, as if she had never been there at all. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence, his brilliant mind already working through possibilities, eliminating the impossible to find what remained, however improbable. And I, settling deeper into my chair, felt the familiar thrill of a case beginning, the promise of mystery and revelation that always accompanied our investigations. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and the night deepened around us, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The silence that followed stretched and deepened, becoming almost tangible, a living presence in the room that wrapped itself around us like velvet. Holmes remained motionless, his profile sharp against the firelight, a study in concentration that I had witnessed countless times before, yet never ceased to find remarkable. The Reverend Blackwood shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, uncertain, creaking softly beneath him, uncertain whether to speak or to wait for the great detective to break the spell of his contemplation. When Holmes finally stirred, it was with the sudden fluidity of a cat waking from apparent sleep. He rose and crossed to his desk, which stood against the far wall beneath the window, its surface a chaos of papers, chemical apparatus, and mysterious objects that only he could identify. From one of the many drawers, he extracted a large-scale map of London and its environs, spreading it across the cleared space of the side table with careful hands. The paper whispered as it unfolded, revealing the intricate web of streets, parks, and cemeteries that comprised the great city. Highgate, he murmured, tracing a long finger along the northern reaches of the map. St. Bartholomew's Church, if memory serves, stands at the convergence of 3 old Roman roads, does it not? A location with considerable historical significance. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, the Reverend confirmed, leaning forward with renewed interest. The church itself dates from the 12th century, though it has been rebuilt several times. The foundations, however, are far older. There are those who believe the site was sacred even before Christianity came to these shores. Celtic, perhaps, or Roman. The cemetery has been in continuous use for nearly 800 years. I moved closer to examine the map, noting the thick green spaces that marked Highgate Cemetery and the surrounding heath. Even on paper, there was something about the area that suggested mystery, the way the roads curved and intersected, the proximity to ancient pathways and forgotten histories. Holmes straightened, his decision evidently made. We shall visit tomorrow. I should like to see this grave in daylight first, to examine the ground, the approaches, the sight lines. Then we shall return after dark to observe these mysterious lights for ourselves, if they choose to appear. He turned to the Reverend with an expression that might have been reassuring on a less intense face. I would ask that you keep our involvement quiet for now. If someone is indeed staging these manifestations for some purpose, I do not wish to alert them to our investigation. Of course, Mr. Holmes, I shall be discretion itself. The Reverend retrieved his hat, which had been resting on his knee, and stood, some of the earlier worry lifted from his features. Shall I meet you at the church, say 10 o'clock? That would be most suitable, Holmes agreed. We shall take the morning train from King's Cross. Do not trouble yourself to show us out, Reverend. Mrs. Hudson will attend to it. After the clergyman had departed, his footsteps fading down the stairs, and the front door closing with a distant thud, Holmes returned to the window, pulling aside the curtain to watch the man's retreating figure merge with the rain-soaked shadows of Baker Street. A hansom cab rattled past, its lamps casting brief golden streaks across the wet pavement. Then darkness and rain reclaimed the street. "Well, Watson," he said without turning, "what do you make of our ghostly mystery?" I had returned to my chair and was refilling my teacup, the pot still warm, the tea having steeped to perfect strength during the Reverend's visit. The liquid poured smooth and dark, steam rising in lazy spirals. I confess I am torn between natural skepticism and genuine curiosity. The roses are certainly peculiar, particularly if they appear in winter. That suggests someone with access to a hothouse, someone with means and dedication. Excellent, Watson. Your reasoning improves with each case we undertake. Holmes abandoned the window and began to pace, a sure sign that his mind was fully engaged. His movements took him from fireplace to bookshelf, from bookshelf to desk, a circuit he traced again and again as he spoke. Consider the timing. Why begin this elaborate performance 6 weeks ago? Why not earlier or later? 20 years is a long time to wait before staging a haunting. Something must have changed. Some catalyst must have prompted action. Perhaps the anniversary of her death, I suggested. The Reverend mentioned she died 20 years ago this month. The fire popped suddenly, sending a small glowing ember onto the hearthrug. I moved quickly to retrieve it with the poker, returning it safely to the grate before it could cause damage. The interruption seemed to break Holmes from his reverie, and he glanced at the clock with surprise, as if only just realizing how late the hour had grown. "Past midnight, Watson. We should rest. Tomorrow promises to be illuminating, one way or another." He moved toward his bedroom door, then paused, turning back with an expression that was almost playful. "Do you still have that service revolver of yours? The weather-beaten one that has served us so well in the past?" "Always," I confirmed. somewhat taken aback. "Surely you do not expect danger." "I expect nothing and prepare for everything," Holmes replied. "Ghosts, as a rule, are harmless. Living people pretending to be ghosts, however, can prove rather more problematic. Good night, my dear fellow. Dream of roses and moonlight, of mysteries waiting to be solved." With that, he disappeared into his chamber, leaving me alone with a dying fire and my thoughts. I sat for a while longer, listening to the rain's eternal whisper against the windows, watching shadows dance across the walls as the flames gradually subsided. The room had grown cooler. The tea things sat abandoned on their tray, and the map of London still lay spread across the side table, a promise of tomorrow's adventure marked in ink and paper. Eventually, I rose and made my own way to bed, but sleep proved elusive. My mind kept returning to the image the Reverend had painted, a young woman standing in moonlight beside a marble angel, reaching out for something forever beyond her grasp. There was something deeply melancholic about the picture, something that touched the heart, even as the rational mind sought explanations. Whatever we might discover in Highgate's ancient cemetery, I suspected that the truth would prove as compelling as any ghost story, as it so often did when Sherlock Holmes took an interest in the apparently supernatural. The rain continued through the night, a constant presence, washing the city clean, filling gutters and downspouts with its persistent flow. Somewhere in the darkness, the cemetery waited, its stones and monuments standing silent vigil over the dead, its paths winding between past and present, known and unknown. And somewhere among those graves, the Ashworth tomb stood crowned by its marble angel, guardian of secrets 2 decades old, witness to whatever strange performances played out beneath the moon's cold light. Morning arrived grey and damp, the rain having finally ceased, but leaving behind a world wrapped in mist. I woke to find Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, surrounded by newspapers, both current and archived, his sharp eyes scanning columns of text with machine-like efficiency. Mrs. Hudson had provided her usual excellent breakfast, kidneys and eggs, and thick slices of toast with orange marmalade, though Holmes, as was his custom during cases, barely touched his plate. "Ah, Watson, good morning," he greeted me without looking up from his paper. "I have been researching the Ashworth family. Fascinating reading. Sir Richard was something of an eccentric, it seems. He held several patents for agricultural innovations, and was deeply interested in botany, a passion he apparently passed to his daughter. After Eleanor's death, he became a recluse, refused all visitors, and spent his final year obsessively tending a rose garden on his estate. White roses exclusively, according to this account from the Gardener's Chronicle. I helped myself to breakfast, the food warm and comforting, the coffee strong and dark. That certainly adds a layer of poignancy to the flowers appearing on her grave. Indeed, but poignancy aside, it also provides a potential connection. White roses, botanical knowledge, a grieving father who devoted his last year to cultivating them. Holmes finally set aside his paper and reached for his coffee cup, taking a long, appreciative drink. The question becomes, who else might have shared or inherited that obsession? The estate passed to a cousin, but I wonder what became of the household staff, the gardeners, those who witnessed the father's grief firsthand. Our conversation continued as we finished breakfast and prepared for the day's expedition. Holmes selected his heaviest overcoat and a sturdy walking stick, while I ensured my medical bag was properly stocked and my revolver secured in my pocket. The morning remained grey, the sky a uniform pewter that promised more rain before day's end. But for now, the streets were merely damp, the air fresh and cool. The journey to King's Cross Station passed in relative quiet, the city slowly awakening around us, shop shutters being raised, delivery carts making their rounds, the great machine of London commerce beginning its daily operation. Our train departed precisely on time, as the timetables promised, carrying us northward through gradually changing neighbourhoods, from the prosperous centre to the more varied northern reaches, where city gave way to heath and cemetery and ancient woodland. Highgate Station received us with the kind of peaceful quietness that characterised suburban stops, a world away from the bustle of central London, despite being only a few miles distant. The Reverend Blackwood waited for us on the platform, looking somewhat more composed than he had the previous night, though worry still creased his brow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. The church is but a short walk from here, perhaps 10 minutes. He gestured up a narrow lane that climbed gently between high walls overgrown with ivy. "Shall we proceed? I confess I am most eager to have your opinion on this troubling matter." We set off together, our footsteps echoing softly against the damp stones, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and growing things. Above us, clouds moved slowly across the sky, their bellies heavy with moisture not yet ready to fall. The lane curved upward, revealing glimpses of the heath beyond, wild and green and timeless, unchanged for centuries, while the city grew and transformed around it. The old church emerged gradually from the mist, its ancient stones grey and weathered, its square tower rising solid and reassuring against the uncertain sky. The cemetery spread out beside and behind it, a vast field of monuments and markers, angels and crosses, simple stones and elaborate tombs, all bearing witness to the countless lives that had ended and been laid to rest in this sacred ground. It was beautiful in its melancholy way, peaceful and permanent, a place where time seemed to move more slowly, where the past pressed close against the present. "The Ashworth tomb lies this way," the Reverend said quietly, leading us along a path that wound between older monuments, their inscriptions worn nearly smooth by centuries of wind and rain. "In the northeast section, beneath a great oak tree, you will know it when you see it. The white marble is quite distinctive." We walked in single file along the narrow path, our feet finding purchase on stones made slick by moss, and morning stones made slick by moss and morning dew. The cemetery unfolded around us like the pages of an enormous book, each monument a paragraph in a story centuries in the making. Here lay merchants and soldiers, mothers and children, artists and labourers, all equal now beneath the patient earth. The oak trees that lined the pathways stretched their ancient limbs overhead, their leaves whispering secrets in a language older than words, while beneath our feet the ground felt soft and yielding, as if the dead themselves were breathing slowly far below. Holmes moved with purpose, but without haste, his keen eyes taking in every detail of our surroundings. He noted the angle of the paths, the placement of monuments relative to one another, the way certain graves showed signs of recent visitation, while others languished in neglect. His mind was cataloguing, organising, building a mental map that would serve him when darkness fell. And these same paths must be navigated by moonlight or lamplight, or whatever illumination the night might provide. The northeast section of the cemetery occupied slightly higher ground, and as we climbed the gentle slope, the vista opened around us. To our left, London spread out in the distance, a grey smudge beneath grey skies, church spires and factory chimneys, rising like pins through fabric. To our right, the wild heath rolled away toward horizons lost in mist, a reminder that wilderness still existed at the very edge of civilization, patient and eternal, waiting for the city to crumble back into soil. And there, beneath the spreading branches of an oak that must have been old when the cemetery was new, stood the Ashworth tomb. The Reverend had understated its magnificence. It was not merely a grave, but a small chapel unto itself, constructed of white marble that gleamed even beneath the overcast sky, as if it held some inner light that weather and time could not diminish. The structure rose perhaps 10 feet high, its roof peaked and tiled with slate, its sides carved with intricate patterns of roses and vines that seemed to grow and twist around the marble as if alive. But it was the angel that commanded attention, a life-sized figure carved with such skill that one could almost believe it might spread its wings and ascend at any moment, leaving behind only the memory of grace. The angel stood atop the tomb's roof, one hand raised in blessing or perhaps warning, the other holding a single rose across its breast. Its face was turned toward the east, toward the rising sun, and its expression conveyed a sadness so profound that it seemed to reach across the years and touch the heart of any who looked upon it. Even I, practical doctor that I was, felt something stir within me at the sight, some recognition of grief made permanent, love transformed into stone. Extraordinary, Holmes murmured, approaching the tomb with the reverence he usually reserved for particularly elegant solutions to complex problems. The craftsmanship alone must have cost a fortune. This is the work of a master sculptor, Watson. Note the detail in the feathers, the way the drapery falls so naturally. This is not merely mourning art. This is devotion made manifest. Fresh roses lay at the base of the monument, just as the Reverend had described. A dozen perfect white blooms, their petals still tight and fresh, showing no sign of wilting, despite having been exposed to the elements. They had been arranged with care, placed in a simple ceramic vase that bore no maker's mark, no indication of origin. Holmes knelt beside the flowers, producing his magnifying glass from an inner pocket with the practiced ease of long habit. He examined the roses minutely, noting the precise cut of their stems, the particular shade of white, the development stage of each bloom. Several minutes passed in silence, save for the distant call of a crow and the rustling of leaves overhead. The Reverend and I stood back, knowing better than to interrupt, when Holmes entered this state of focused examination. Finally, he straightened, slipping the glass back into his pocket. These were cut within the past 12 hours, no more. The stems show a clean diagonal cut, made with very sharp shears, the kind used by professional gardeners. They are Madame Hardy roses, a variety introduced in the tea, known for their pure white colour and exceptional fragrance. They require skilled cultivation and do not grow wild anywhere in England. He moved around the tomb with slow, deliberate steps, examining the ground, the monument's base, the surrounding area with that same intense attention to detail. The earth showed no obvious disturbance, no footprints save those the Reverend had pointed out as belonging to the groundskeeper during his morning rounds. The grass grew thick and even, unmarked by any passage that might indicate regular visitation. "Tell me, Reverend," Holmes said, not looking up from his examination, "has anything been disturbed? Any attempt made to enter the tomb itself?" "No, Mr. Holmes. The seal remains intact, as you can see." The Reverend gestured toward the tomb's entrance, a small bronze door set into the southern face, secured with an elaborate lock green with verdigris. Sir Richard had it sealed after his own death. To my knowledge, it has not been opened in nearly 19 years. Holmes produced a small brush from another pocket and carefully swept away some debris from around the door's frame, revealing the untouched dust and grime that had accumulated there. "No, this has not been disturbed recently, so our mysterious visitor does not enter the tomb, merely leaves their offering and departs." A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, setting the oak leaves to rattling and causing the longer grass to bow and sway. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I found myself drawing my coat more tightly around me. The clouds overhead had thickened, and the light took on that peculiar quality that precedes rain, everything appearing sharper and more defined, colours more vivid against the grey backdrop. "Is there anyone else buried in this tomb?" Holmes asked, running his hand along the carved roses with surprising gentleness. "Only Sir Richard himself," the Reverend replied. "Eleanor was the last of her direct line. The cousin who inherited the estate has his own family plot elsewhere, and has made clear he wants nothing to do with this one. He maintains it out of obligation, nothing more, or rather, he pays for its maintenance. He has never actually visited, to my knowledge." Holmes completed his circuit of the monument, and stood for a moment in quiet contemplation, his eyes distant, processing what he had observed. Then he turned his attention to the area surrounding the tomb, walking in gradually expanding circles, examining other nearby graves, the path that led to this section, the sight lines to and from various points. I followed at a respectful distance, noting what he noted when I could discern it. A tree root that had pushed up through the path here, creating a natural trip hazard that anyone walking at night would need to navigate carefully. A clear line of sight from a particular monument that would allow someone to observe the Ashworth tomb while remaining concealed. The way the ground sloped such that water would naturally drain away from this area, keeping it relatively dry even in heavy rain. "The groundskeeper, this Thomas Finch," Holmes called back to the Reverend. "Is he available? I should very much like to speak with him. He should be working somewhere on the grounds. I shall find him for you." The Reverend set off down one of the paths, his figure gradually disappearing behind monuments and trees, leaving Holmes and I alone with the angel and her roses. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, moving to stand beside him as he gazed up at the marble figure towering above us. "I make of it that someone with considerable resources, knowledge, and dedication is staging an elaborate performance," he replied. "But the question that interests me most, Watson, is not how they are doing it. The mechanics are fairly straightforward once one eliminates the supernatural. No, what fascinates me is why. What drives someone to maintain this vigil for 6 weeks? What purpose does it serve? And why now, after 2 decades of silence?" Before I could formulate a response, the sound of approaching footsteps drew our attention. The Reverend returned, accompanied by an elderly man whose weathered face and gnarled hands spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. He wore the simple clothes of a working man, corduroy trousers and a worn jacket. a cap pulled low over his white hair. He regarded Holmes with the cautious respect that many showed the detective, having heard of his reputation, even if they had never met him personally. "This is Thomas Finch," the Reverend introduced. "He has been the groundskeeper here for 43 years. If anyone knows every corner of this cemetery, every stone and path, it is Thomas." "Mr. Finch," Holmes greeted him with surprising warmth. "I am grateful for your time. The Reverend tells me you were the first to notice the roses appearing on the Ashworth grave. Can you tell me exactly what you observed?" The old man cleared his throat, his voice, when it came rough from years of outdoor work, but clear and precise. "It was 6 weeks ago, come Tuesday, sir. I does my rounds every morning at dawn, checking on things, making sure no vandals have been about during the night. When I come to this part of the cemetery, the sun just breaking over the trees, I sees the roses, dozen of them, fresh as could be, in that vase there. Struck me as odd, it did, because no one tends this grave regular-like, has not for years." "And you found them at dawn, you say? What time precisely?" "5:30, sir. I am a creature of habit. Same route, same time, every morning these 43 years. There was quiet pride in his voice, the satisfaction of duty faithfully performed across decades. "Have you ever been here at night? During your tenure, have you had occasion to be in the cemetery after dark?" "Oh, aye, sir. Many times. Foxes sometimes make trouble, and there have been cases of young folk using the place for mischief. I knows every sound this place makes, day or night. The owls, the wind through different trees, the way the paths sound under different conditions. I could navigate it blindfolded if need be." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And the lights? You have seen them yourself?" "That I have, sir. 2 weeks after the roses started appearing. I were checking on a gate that had been reported loose. Must have been near 11 at night. I seen them floating among the stones yonder." He pointed toward a section of older graves some distance away. Blue-white they were, like marsh lights, moving slow and purposeful, not random-like. Watched them for maybe 10 minutes before they faded away. Never seen nothing like it in all my years here. Did they make any sound? Any smell? Did you feel anything unusual?" The old groundskeeper considered this carefully, his brow furrowing with the effort of precise recollection. "No sound, sir. Silent as the grave, if you will pardon the expression. No smell neither. But I will say this, there were a chill in the air that night, colder than it should have been for the season. Felt it in my bones, I did. Made me think of winter, though it was still autumn." Holmes nodded slowly, filing away this information in that remarkable mind of his. "One final question, Mr. Finch. In your 43 years here, have you ever known anyone to take particular interest in the Ashworth tomb? Anyone who visited regularly or asked questions about the family?" "Not regular, no, sir. Occasional curious types, history enthusiasts and such. They sometimes wander through looking at the older monuments. And there was someone, maybe 10 years back, a woman, I think, though I never got close enough to be certain. She stood looking at the angel for a good while, then left. But that were just the once, and long ago now." The conversation continued for several more minutes, Holmes extracting every detail the groundskeeper could provide. But it was clear that Thomas Finch, observant though he was, had no explanation for the mysterious appearances. Eventually, Holmes thanked him, and the old man returned to his duties, leaving us once more with the Reverend. The promised rain began to fall, first as a light mist that hung in the air like breath on a cold morning, then gradually strengthening to a proper drizzle. The drops pattered against the marble angel, running down its carved features like tears, pooling in the folds of its stone robes. "We shall return tonight," Holmes announced, pulling his coat collar up against the rain. "I wish to observe the cemetery after dark, to see if our mysterious lights make an appearance. Reverend, I would ask that you say nothing of our visit to anyone. If questioned, merely say that you have engaged investigators to look into the matter, but provide no details." "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Shall I accompany you tonight?" "That will not be necessary. Watson and I work best alone, and we may need to be quite still and patient for extended periods. 3 is too many for concealment. Simply ensure that the cemetery gates remain accessible. We shall let ourselves in quietly after dark." We made our way back through the rain-soaked cemetery, the monuments taking on a different character in the grey light and falling moisture, more sombre, more mysterious. By the time we reached the station, all 3 of us were thoroughly damp, and I found myself looking forward to the warm train carriage and eventually the comfortable fire waiting at Baker Street. The railway carriage swayed gently as the train carried us back toward central London, its rhythmic motion a kind of lullaby that made the damp afternoon feel almost dreamlike. Outside the rain-streaked windows, the city gradually reclaimed the landscape, buildings growing denser, streets narrower, until the wild heath and ancient cemetery felt like something from another world entirely. A pocket of timelessness preserved against the relentless advance of pre-relentless advance of progress. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame folded into the corner seat, his eyes closed, but his mind clearly active, processing the morning's observations with that extraordinary faculty he possessed for organizing vast amounts of information into coherent patterns. I had learned long ago not to interrupt these periods of intense mental activity. Instead, I occupied myself watching the passing scenery, the grey suburbs giving way to the grey city, gasworks and warehouses, row houses and corner shops, all washed in the perpetual drizzle that seemed to have settled over London for the duration. Other passengers shared our carriage, a businessman with his newspaper, a young woman with a basket of market goods, an elderly gentleman dozing with his chin on his chest, but none paid us any particular attention. We were simply 2 more travellers among thousands, making the daily journey across the capital's vast expanse. The train's whistle announced our approach to King's Cross, its piercing note cutting through the afternoon quiet. Holmes stirred, opening his eyes and straightening in his seat with a slight grimace that suggested his cramped position had not been entirely comfortable. He consulted his pocket watch, noting the time with satisfaction. "Excellent. We have several hours before darkness falls, time enough for research and preparation." He stood as the train began to slow, swaying easily with its motion, reaching for the overhead rack where our belongings rested. "There are several avenues of inquiry I wish to pursue this afternoon, Watson. The question of the roses, for instance. Madame Hardy varieties in December. That requires a substantial greenhouse operation, probably commercial rather than private. There cannot be more than 12 establishments in Greater London capable of producing such flowers in this season." We disembarked into the controlled chaos of the station, the great iron and glass cathedral filled with steam and sound, passengers hurrying to and fro, porters calling out, locomotives breathing like enormous beasts of metal and fire. The familiar bustle of it felt almost comforting after the cemetery's quiet melancholy. A reminder that life continued in all its ordinary complexity, regardless of what mysteries might lurk in Highgate's ancient grounds. A cab carried us through the rain-slicked streets back to Baker Street, and by the time we climbed the 17 steps to our sitting room, Mrs. Hudson had already laid out a late lunch, sandwiches and cheese, and a steaming pot of tea that promised warmth and sustenance. The fire had been built up, the lamps lit against the grey afternoon, and the familiar comfort of our rooms wrapped around us like a favourite coat worn soft with time. Holmes went immediately to his files, those enormous cabinets where he kept clippings, notes, correspondence, and references on every conceivable subject, organised according to some system that only he fully understood. I poured tea for both of us, the porcelain cups thin and delicate, inherited from some aunt of Holmes's who had possessed refined taste and the means to indulge it. The tea was strong and hot, cutting through the afternoon's chill, and I carried Holmes's cup to where he stood, surrounded by opened drawers and scattered papers. Ah, excellent, Watson. Just what I needed. He accepted the cup without looking up from the document he was examining, a list of some kind covered in his own angular handwriting. I am compiling a register of commercial florists and nurseries. We shall need to make several inquiries this afternoon, before the establishments close for the day. The afternoon passed in that peculiar mixture of tedium and anticipation that characterize the investigative portions of our cases. We visited 3 florist shops, each one a small island of green and colour against the grey city. Their windows steamed from the warmth within, their air heavy with the scent of earth and growing things. At each location, Holmes made discreet inquiries about white roses, Madame Hardy specifically, purchased in quantity, delivered regularly. The florists were helpful, but could provide no useful information. Their ledgers showed no such orders. Their suppliers knew of no unusual demands for that particular variety. The 4th shop proved more interesting. It occupied a corner lot in Bloomsbury, its frontage modest, but its greenhouse extending back into a surprisingly large garden. The proprietor, a Mr. Cornelius Webb, was a man in his 60s, with soil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, and the weather-beaten complexion of someone who spent his life coaxing beauty from the earth. He studied Holmes carefully when the question of white roses arose, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossing his lined face. Madame Hardy, you say? In winter? He set down the pruning shears he had been cleaning and gave Holmes his full attention. That is specialized work, that is. Requires skill and proper facilities. I grow some myself, though not in quantity. But I know someone who does. Had a customer once, years back now, who wanted nothing but white roses. Thousands of them over time. Particular about the variety too. Had to be Madame Hardy or Alba. Nothing else would do. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his entire body expressing focused interest. Years back, you say. Can you be more specific? Would have been, 20 years ago now. Maybe a bit more. Man came in regular-like for near on a year, ordering roses every week, never gave a name, always paid in cash. But I remember him because of the quantity and the insistence on that specific variety. Then one day, he just stopped coming, never saw him again. Can you describe him? Webb scratched his chin thoughtfully, calling up memories 2 decades old. Tall fellow, well-dressed but quiet, kept his hat pulled low, had a way of speaking that suggested education, quality. His hands were not labourers' hands, if you take my meaning. He carried himself like someone used to giving orders, though he was always polite enough with me. And you have no idea why he wanted so many roses. Never asked, sir. Not my place to question customers, and he paid well. But I will say this, there was a sadness about him. You could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at the roses when I brought them out. Like they meant something more to him than just flowers, if you understand me. Holmes produced a coin and pressed it into the florist's hand. You have been most helpful, Mr. Webb. If by chance this customer should ever return, I would be grateful if you would send word to this address. He handed over his card, which Webb examined with interest before tucking it carefully into his waistcoat pocket. As we emerged back into the late afternoon, the rain had finally ceased, though the sky remained heavy and dark. The street lamps were being lit, their warm glow reflecting off wet cobblestones, creating pools of light in the gathering dusk. Holmes set a brisk pace back toward Baker Street, his mind clearly working through this new information. 20 years ago, Watson, he said as we walked. Roughly the time when Sir Richard Ashworth was mourning his daughter, spending his final year tending his rose garden. And now, 20 years later, roses begin appearing on Eleanor's grave with the same regularity, the same dedication. The pattern is too precise to be coincidental. But Sir Richard is long dead, I pointed out. If he was the customer Webb remembers, and I grant you it seems likely, then who carries on his ritual now? That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must discover tonight. Mrs. Hudson had dinner waiting when we returned, a hearty stew that filled the rooms with savoury aromas, along with fresh bread and butter. We ate in companionable silence, both of us conscious of the long night ahead and the need for sustenance before our vigil began. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily onward, measuring the hours until darkness would be complete, and we could return to Highgate Cemetery to witness whatever strange performance awaited us there. After dinner, Holmes began his preparations with the methodical care he always brought to fieldwork. He selected dark clothing, a black woolen coat that would blend with shadows, a scarf to wrap around his face if needed. From a locked drawer in his desk, he retrieved a dark lantern, the kind that could be shuttered to show no light, or opened to provide a focused beam. He checked the oil level, tested the mechanism, nodded with satisfaction. I likewise changed into darker attire, and ensured my revolver was loaded and easily accessible. The weight of it in my pocket was reassuring, though I hoped sincerely that it would not be needed. Still, Holmes's earlier words about the difference between ghosts and living people, pretending to be ghosts, echoed in my mind, and I preferred to be prepared. By 9 o'clock, we were ready. The night had grown fully dark, the kind of thick darkness that comes in winter, especially after days of rain. The streets of London stretched before us, lit at intervals by gas lamps, but between those pools of light lay long stretches of shadow where anything might hide. We hailed a cab and directed the driver to take us to Highgate, though we had him let us out some distance from the church, not wishing to announce our arrival. The walk through the darkened streets to the cemetery felt like a journey into another time. The sounds of the city faded behind us, replaced by the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crunch of our footsteps on gravel. The air had grown cold after the rain, and our breath formed clouds that dissipated slowly in the still night. The cemetery gates stood open, as the Reverend had promised. The ironwork was elaborate, Victorian craftsmanship at its finest, depicting angels and lilies, crosses and scrollwork. Beyond it, the cemetery stretched away into darkness, the monuments visible only as darker shapes against the dark sky. No lights burned here, no living souls moved among the dead. It was a place surrendered to silence and shadow, waiting. Holmes paused just inside the gates, allowing our eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. Gradually, shapes became clearer, the path winding between graves, the larger monuments rising like sentinels, the trees spreading their skeletal branches overhead. The moon, obscured behind clouds, provided almost no illumination, but our eyes adapted, finding ways to navigate by gradations of darkness rather than light. "This way," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible. "We shall position ourselves near the Ashworth tomb, but not so close as to be immediately visible should anyone approach. There is a monument I noted this morning that will serve admirably." We moved slowly, carefully, conscious that any sound might carry in the profound quiet. The path we had walked so easily in daylight now required complete attention, each step placed deliberately to avoid roots and uneven stones. Around us, the cemetery seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting with us for whatever the night might reveal. The monument Holmes had selected for our concealment was a substantial Celtic cross carved from dark granite, weathered by more than a century of English weather into something that seemed almost organic, as though it had grown from the earth rather than been placed there by human hands. It stood perhaps 12 feet high, its broad arms providing cover, while its proximity to a cluster of yew trees offered additional shadow. From this vantage point, we could observe the Ashworth tomb clearly, no more than 30 yards distant, its white marble visible even in the darkness, like a pale ghost among the darker stones. We settled ourselves behind the cross, arranging our coats beneath us to insulate against the cold stone and damp earth. The position was not comfortable, but comfort was not our purpose tonight. Holmes extinguished the small hand lamp we had used to navigate the final approach, and we sat in complete darkness, allowing our senses to attune themselves fully to the cemetery's nocturnal character. The silence was not absolute, as true silence never is. There were small sounds everywhere once one learned to listen. The movement of wind through grass, the settling of earth, the distant sound of the city like a muted heartbeat beyond the cemetery walls, the occasional rustle that might have been a mouse or vole going about its nightly business. Holmes remained perfectly still beside me, his breathing so controlled that at times I had to reassure myself he was still there. This was one of his many remarkable qualities, this ability to become utterly motionless, to wait with inhuman patience for whatever might develop. I had seen him maintain such vigils before, once for 7 hours in a freezing warehouse, another time for an entire night in a tree outside a country house. He possessed a discipline that bordered on the supernatural itself, though it was born of training and will rather than any mystical quality. The church clock struck 11, its notes carrying clearly across the still air, each chime measured and precise. 11 reverberations fading into silence. Still nothing stirred near the Ashworth tomb. The white marble gleamed faintly, catching what little ambient light existed, but no mysterious illumination appeared, no ghostly figure manifested from the shadows. Then, as the last echo of the 11th chime died away, something changed. The temperature dropped perceptibly, not gradually, but suddenly, as if a door had opened onto winter itself. Our breath became visible, thick clouds that hung in the air. And from somewhere, everywhere, nowhere, came a sound. It was singing, just as the Reverend had described, but hearing it explained why words had failed him. It was not quite human, this song, though it seemed to be shaped by human throat and lungs. The melody was unlike anything I had ever encountered, neither hymn nor folksong, nor any musical tradition I could identify. It rose and fell in strange intervals, haunting and beautiful, and deeply unsettling all at once. There were no words that I could discern, only pure sound that seemed to emanate from the very air itself, as if the night had found voice. Beside me, I felt Holmes tense, every fibre of his being focused on that impossible sound. His hand found my arm in the darkness, squeezed once, a signal to remain absolutely still. The singing continued, perhaps for 2 minutes, perhaps for 10, time becoming fluid and uncertain in the presence of something so otherworldly. Then, as mysteriously as it had begun, it faded, the last notes dissipating like morning mist beneath the sun. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with the memory of that strange song. But we had no time to process what we had heard, because the lights appeared. They came from the direction of the older section of the cemetery, beyond the Ashworth tomb. Blue-white orbs, perhaps the size of lanterns, floating 3 or 4 feet above the ground. There were 6 of them, moving in a loose formation, weaving between monuments with purposeful grace. They cast no beams, created no shadows, simply existed as points of cold luminescence, drifting through the darkness like phosphorescent fish through deep water. My hand moved instinctively to my revolver, but Holmes's grip on my arm tightened, holding me in place. His message was clear: observe, do not act. We watched as the lights approached the Ashworth tomb, circling it slowly, their movement almost ceremonial. They maintained perfect spacing from one another, suggesting intelligence, purpose, coordination. This was no natural phenomenon, no marsh gas or luminescent fungi. These lights were under someone's control, but how and by whom remained shrouded in mystery. For perhaps 5 minutes, the lights continued their slow orbit of the tomb, casting their eerie glow across the white marble, making the angel appear to move in the shifting illumination, its stone face seeming to change expression as light and shadow played across its carved features. Then, one by one, the lights began to fade, dimming gradually until they winked out entirely, leaving us in darkness once more, blinking against the sudden absence of even that cold illumination. Extraordinary, Holmes breathed, so quietly that I barely heard him. Did you note the pattern of their movement, Watson? Not random at all, but precisely choreographed, and the timing, beginning exactly as the clock finished striking 11. This is theatre, my friend, performance staged for maximum effect. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps, not the heavy tread of boots, but something softer, more careful, approaching from the direction opposite to where the lights had appeared. Someone was moving through the cemetery, and they were coming toward the Ashworth tomb. We pressed ourselves closer to the granite cross, becoming one with its shadow. The footsteps grew nearer, accompanied now by the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet breathing of someone moving with effort through the dark. A figure emerged from the gloom, barely visible, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the night. They carried something a bundle or bag, and moved with the confidence of someone who knew these paths well, who had walked them many times before. The figure approached the tomb and knelt before it, setting down their burden with a soft sound. In the darkness, we could not see clearly what they were doing, but the actions suggested ritual, practiced movements performed many times. Minutes passed as we watched, hardly daring to breathe, while the mysterious visitor conducted their business at Eleanor Ashworth's grave. Finally, the figure rose, stood for a moment as if in prayer or contemplation, then turned and began to retrace their steps, moving away from us towards the southern gates of the cemetery. Holmes waited until they had gone perhaps 20 yards, then rose silently, gesturing for me to follow. We moved as quietly as possible, keeping to the grass beside the path, where our footsteps would make less sound, maintaining distance enough that we could retreat into concealment if our quarry should turn around. The pursuit led us through the cemetery's winding ways, past monuments both grand and humble, beneath spreading trees, and through open spaces where we felt dangerously exposed. Our quarry moved steadily, never hurrying but never hesitating, following a route they clearly knew well. We followed like shadows, Holmes leading, myself close behind, both of us grateful for the covering darkness, even as it made our tracking more difficult. The figure reached the southern gates and passed through them without pause, turning onto the road that led toward Highgate Village. Street lamps provided intermittent illumination here, and we hung back further, using the pools of darkness between lights to maintain our pursuit without being observed. In the lamplight, I caught fleeting glimpses of our quarry. Average height, dark coat, head covered by a hood or shawl, walking with a slight stoop that might indicate age or simply caution. The chase, for so it had become, led us through quiet residential streets where respectable people slept behind curtained windows, past shuttered shops and dark alleyways, always southward, always with that same steady pace. My legs ached from the awkward crouch we had maintained behind the granite cross, and my breath came harder now with exertion. But Holmes seemed tireless, driven by the thrill of pursuit and the promise of answers. Then our quarry made an unexpected turn, leaving the road for a narrow lane that led toward what appeared to be a substantial property surrounded by high walls overgrown with ivy. The walls were old, perhaps as old as the cemetery itself, constructed of the same grey stone that characterized this part of London. An iron gate stood partially open, creaking softly in the light breeze that had begun to stir. "The Ashworth estate," Holmes whispered, pulling me into the shadow of a large oak tree that overhung the wall. "Unless I am very much mistaken, Watson, we are about to learn a great deal more about this mystery." We watched as the figure slipped through the gate and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Holmes waited a full minute, counting silently, then moved forward with renewed caution. The gate yielded to his touch without sound, and we passed through into what had once been a grand garden, but now showed signs of long neglect. Overgrown paths wound between beds gone wild. Statuary stood covered in moss and lichen, and everywhere the sense of abandonment hung heavy as fog. A house loomed before us, a substantial Victorian mansion of the kind built by wealthy merchants in the previous century. Most of its windows were dark, but a light showed in one of the ground floor rooms, warm and yellow against the night. We approached carefully, using ornamental shrubs and the deeper shadows near the walls for cover, until we stood beneath the lighted window, able to peer inside. The room beyond was a conservatory, though not the neglected structure one might have expected from the garden's condition. This space was carefully maintained, the glass clean, the interior filled with plants arranged with obvious care and attention. And there, in the centre of it all, beneath the warm glow of suspended oil lamps, was a sight that made everything suddenly perfectly clear. Roses. Hundreds of roses, all white, all in various stages of bloom, filling the conservatory with their beauty and their heavy, sweet perfume that we could almost smell even through the glass. They grew in large pots arranged on tables and stands, creating a forest of white blossoms that seemed to glow in the lamplight. And moving among them, tending them with careful hands, removing her dark coat to reveal the simple grey dress of a housekeeper or servant, was an elderly woman whose face, even in profile, showed the weight of long years and deeper sorrows. She moved among the roses with the familiarity of long practice, checking blooms, adjusting stakes, her lips moving as if she spoke to them, though we could hear nothing through the glass. There was something infinitely sad about the scene, this old woman alone in her glass house full of white roses, maintaining a vigil that had clearly lasted decades. The question, Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible, even to me standing right beside him, is whether she is conspirator or devotee, whether this is elaborate fraud or genuine memorial. We shall need to speak with her, but not tonight. She has had enough disturbance for one evening. Tomorrow, Watson. Tomorrow we shall return in daylight and hear her story properly told. We withdrew as quietly as we had come, retracing our steps through the abandoned garden, through the creaking gate, back into the civilized streets of Highgate, where the gas lamps burned and the world made sense again. By the time we reached the main road and found a late cab to carry us back to Baker Street, the night had progressed toward that darkest hour that comes just before dawn, when the world holds its breath, waiting for light to return. Holmes had spent the small hours reviewing his notes, cross-referencing observations, constructing timelines, and mapping connections with that remarkable mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. Now, as grey light filtered through the windows, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, he set down his pen and stretched, the bones in his back cracking audibly after hours of hunched concentration. "We are missing something, Watson," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "The pieces are before us, yet the picture remains incomplete. The woman in the conservatory, clearly maintaining the roses, clearly responsible for their daily appearance at the grave. But the lights, the singing, those require different explanations, different mechanisms. This is not the work of one person acting alone." I poured us both fresh coffee from the pot Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully brought up an hour earlier, the dark liquid steaming as it filled our cups. Perhaps she has accomplices, others who share her devotion to Eleanor Ashworth's memory. Possibly, though the coordination would need to be remarkable. Did you note how the lights began their performance exactly as the church clock finished striking 11? That suggests either precise timing devices or clear sightlines to the church tower. And the singing, Watson, that was no mechanical contrivance, no phonograph recording. Someone was singing, someone with unusual vocal ability and extensive musical training. Through the windows, London was slowly coming to life. The first delivery wagons rattled past on the cobblestones below, their drivers hunched against the cold. A lamplighter made his rounds, extinguishing the gas lamps one by one as daylight, such as it was, took over their duty. Somewhere, a church bell tolled the hour, 7 sonorous notes marking the arrival of morning proper. "We should return to Highgate this afternoon," Holmes continued, warming his hands on his coffee cup. "Give the lady time to complete her morning routine, time to settle. I wish to speak with her in circumstances that allow for honest conversation, not confrontation. There is a story here, Watson, one that extends back 20 years and involves grief so profound that it has shaped 2 decades of someone's life. That deserves respect, regardless of whatever else we might discover." Mrs. Hudson arrived with breakfast, a substantial meal of eggs and bacon, toast and marmalade, her maternal instincts clearly activated by our all-night vigil. She fussed over the fire, building it up again, and drew the curtains fully back to admit what light the grey day offered. The familiar ritual of morning domesticity felt almost surreal after the strangeness of the cemetery at midnight. But it was a welcome anchor, a reminder of the ordinary world that existed alongside the mysterious one we had been investigating. After breakfast, Holmes surprised me by suggesting we both attempt some rest. "We shall be more effective with a few hours of sleep. Set your alarm for 1 o'clock, Watson. We shall lunch late, and then make our way to Highgate while the afternoon light lasts." I retired to my room, drew the curtains against the pale daylight, and fell almost immediately into a sleep so profound it felt less like rest and more like a temporary cessation of existence. When my alarm clock finally rang, shattering the silence with its insistent bell, I woke disoriented, unsure for a moment where or even when I was. The room was dark, my curtains having done their work well, and for a confused instant I wondered if I had somehow slept through the entire day into another night. But no, when I pulled back the curtains, afternoon light, dim though it was, greeted me. I washed and dressed, feeling somewhat restored despite the brevity of my rest, and emerged to find Holmes already awake and dressed, looking remarkably fresh considering our nocturnal adventure. He had that quality I had noticed before, of being able to function on minimal sleep when a case demanded it, drawing on reserves of energy that seemed inexhaustible when his interest was engaged. Mrs. Hudson provided a late lunch, soup and bread and cheese, simple fare, but exactly what we needed. As we ate, Holmes outlined his thoughts on how we should approach the afternoon's interview. "We must be gentle, Watson. This woman, whoever she is, has maintained a devotion for 2 decades. That speaks to love, to loyalty, to a promise perhaps made long ago and faithfully kept. We are not the police seeking to prosecute a crime. We are simply men seeking to understand a mystery, and if we approach her with respect and genuine curiosity, I believe she will tell us what we wish to know." By 2:30, we were again on a train bound for Highgate. The journey now familiar, the stations and stops between our starting point and destination becoming known landmarks. The afternoon was grey and cold, but mercifully dry, and when we alighted at Highgate Station, we made our way not toward the church, but directly to the Ashworth estate, approaching this time from the front, rather than through the garden gate we had used the night before. The main entrance was imposing, a pair of iron gates set between stone pillars topped with carved lions, now green with age and weather. The gates stood closed, but not locked, and a small wicket gate set into one of them yielded to Holmes's touch. A long drive led through what had once been parkland, now overgrown and wild, toward the house that rose grey and substantial against the grey sky. In daylight, the mansion's decline was more apparent. Paint peeled from window frames, gutters sagged, and several panes of glass showed cracks or were missing entirely, replaced with boards. Yet there were also signs of limited maintenance, areas where someone had clearly worked to prevent complete deterioration, suggesting the presence of at least one person who cared about the property's survival, even if they lacked the resources to fully restore it. We approached the main door, a massive oak structure studded with iron, and Holmes used the brass knocker, its sound echoing through what we imagined must be largely empty rooms beyond. Minutes passed. We were about to knock again when the door opened, revealing the woman we had seen in the conservatory the night before. In daylight, I could see she was perhaps 70 years of age, though time and hardship had carved deep lines into her face, making precise assessment difficult. Her grey hair was pulled back severely. Her dress was plain black wool of good quality, but clearly old, and her hands showed the roughness of long labour. But her eyes, pale blue and remarkably clear, held intelligence and a kind of resigned dignity that immediately commanded respect. "I have been expecting you," she said, her voice cultured, the accent suggesting education and refinement, despite her servant's dress. "You were in the cemetery last night, observing, and you followed me home. I am not so old that I fail to notice such things, though I confess you were quieter than most would have been." Holmes removed his hat with a slight bow. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We have been asked to investigate certain unusual occurrences at St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, occurrences which I believe you can help us understand." She studied us for a long moment, her gaze moving from Holmes to me and back again, weighing, judging, deciding. Finally, she stepped back and pulled the door wider. "You had better come in then. This is not a conversation to be conducted on the doorstep." The interior of the house matched the exterior's state of genteel decay. Once fine furnishings stood covered with dust sheets. Paintings hung on walls where the paper peeled away in places, and the air held the musty smell of a building too large for its remaining occupants to properly maintain. She led us through corridors and rooms toward the back of the house, her footsteps echoing on bare floorboards, until we reached a small sitting room that clearly served as her living quarters. This room stood in stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was clean, warm, with a fire burning cheerfully in the grate, and furnished with comfortable, if old-fashioned pieces. A kettle sang softly on a hob, and she moved to prepare tea with the automatic movements of long habit, gesturing for us to seat ourselves in the 2 chairs that faced the fire. "I am Margaret Ashworth," she said, as she arranged cups on a tray. "I was Eleanor Ashworth's governess and companion, and later, after her death, I remained in service to Sir Richard until his own passing. Since then, I have lived here alone, maintaining what I can of the house and the gardens, keeping faith with promises made long ago." The tea ceremony proceeded in silence, each movement precise and practiced. She poured, added milk, offered sugar, and only when we all held cups in our hands did she settle herself in a 3rd chair, smaller than ours, positioned slightly apart, as if even now she maintained the distance between servant and those of higher station. "You wish to know about the roses. she said, not quite a question. About the lights and the singing, about why, after 20 years of quiet grief, these manifestations have suddenly begun. The answer is both simple and complex, gentlemen. It begins with love and with tragedy and with a promise that I am bound by honor to keep. She paused, sipping her tea, gathering her thoughts, or perhaps her courage. Outside, a crow called harshly, and somewhere in the house something creaked. The sound of old wood settling, of a building slowly surrendering to time. Eleanor was 19 when she died, but she was more than merely my charge. She was like a daughter to me, the child I never had. I came to the Ashworths when she was but 5 years old, and I watched her grow into a remarkable young woman. Brilliant, beautiful, kind, with a mind that absorbed knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. She could have done anything, been anything, but fate had other plans. Margaret set down her teacup, the china rattling slightly against the saucer, and when she looked up at us, her eyes glistened with tears that she refused to let fall. She was murdered, gentlemen. Make no mistake about that. Though the inquest ruled it an accident, I know what happened that night, and I have carried the truth of it for 20 years, bound to silence by circumstances I cannot yet fully explain. The weight of her words settled over the room like snow falling on a winter, like snow falling on a winter landscape. Each syllable heavy with 2 decades of silence and sorrow. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his expression conveying sympathy, rather than the eager interrogation one might expect from a detective on the verge of revelation. He understood, as I was learning to understand, that this was not merely a case to be solved, but a wound to be carefully opened, examined, and if possible, given the opportunity to finally heal. Margaret Ashworth sat very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if she could see through the walls of this small room, into the past itself, into that terrible night 20 years ago, when a young woman's life ended at the base of Highgate Hill. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the faded wallpaper, and somewhere in the house's upper reaches, a shutter banged once against its frame, stirred by wind finding its way through gaps in the old building's defences. "Tell us," Holmes said gently, his voice carrying none of its usual sharp edge. "Tell us what happened to Eleanor, and why you have kept silent all these years." She drew a long breath, composing herself, and when she began to speak, her voice was steady. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this story countless times in the privacy of her own thoughts, waiting for the day when she might finally be able to share the burden of knowing. "There was a young man," she began, and already one could hear the tragedy building in those simple words. His name was Thomas Garrett, the younger son of a respectable family, fallen on hard times. He was studying to become a physician, working as an assistant to a doctor in the village while completing his education. He and Eleanor met by chance at a lecture on botanical medicine, and it was, I think, love at the very first glance for both of them. She paused to refill our teacups, the pot still warm, the ritual giving her hands something to do, while her mind travelled back through the years. The tea flowed amber and fragrant, and I found myself grateful for its warmth, for the ordinary comfort it provided against the story's gathering darkness. They began meeting in secret, knowing Sir Richard would never approve of the match. Thomas had no fortune, no prospects beyond eventual establishment as a country doctor. Eleanor was destined for someone of rank and wealth, or so her father believed. But they loved each other with the kind of passion that only the young can feel, absolute and all-consuming, heedless of practical concerns or social expectations. Outside the window, afternoon was beginning its slow fade toward evening, the grey light growing dimmer by gradations so subtle they could hardly be marked. A robin landed on the sill, pecked once at the glass as if seeking entry, then flew away with a flash of red breast against the gathering gloom. Eleanor confided in me, of course. She told me everything. They planned to elope, to marry quietly, and present Sir Richard with an accomplished fact, hoping he would accept it, rather than create scandal by disowning his only child. The plan was for her to slip out on the night of the new moon, when darkness would cover her departure. Thomas would be waiting with a carriage at the base of Highgate Hill, and they would travel to Scotland, where English law could not prevent their union. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, and tea sloshed gently against the china. She took a sip, steadying herself, then continued. But someone else knew of their plan. Sir Richard's secretary, a man named Cornelius Blackwell, had discovered the correspondence between them. He was ambitious, you see, and saw opportunity in the situation. He went to Thomas the day before the elopement was to take place, and made him an offer, £10,000 to disappear, to leave Eleanor and never contact her again. Did Thomas accept? I asked, already knowing the answer would bring no comfort. He did not. He refused absolutely, told Blackwell that no amount of money could purchase his abandonment of Eleanor. But Blackwell was not a man to accept refusal easily. He had invested years in cultivating Sir Richard's trust, positioning himself to potentially marry Eleanor himself, once he had eliminated any rivals and convinced her father of his worthiness. Thomas's refusal meant he became an obstacle that needed to be removed by other means. The fire needed attending, and Margaret rose to add coal from the scuttle, the black lumps tumbling into the grate with soft thumps, sending up sparks that climbed the chimney like tiny stars ascending. The fresh fuel caught quickly, and soon the flames burned higher, pushing back the shadows that had been encroaching on our small circle of light and warmth. She fell silent for a moment, and in that silence I heard the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, marking seconds that became minutes, that became the long years between then and now. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of grief, never fully expressed, never fully released. Thomas was there, waiting as promised, but so was Blackwell, hidden in the darkness near the hill's edge. What happened next, I learned only later, pieced together from fragments and whispers, from things Blackwell himself said in his cups before he fled England entirely. There was a confrontation. Thomas refused again to abandon Eleanor, and Blackwell, in rage or desperation or cold calculation, struck him down, killed him, there at the meeting place. And then, when Eleanor arrived and saw what had been done, when she screamed and tried to run for help, he caught her. The robin had returned to the window, or perhaps a different robin, its small form silhouetted against the grey light, its song floating through the glass, a bright thread of sound in the gathering dusk. Margaret watched it for a moment before continuing, as if drawing strength from its simple presence, its uncomplicated existence. He tried to make it appear that she had fallen, pushed her body to the base of the hill, and arranged it carefully. Thomas, he weighted with stones and dropped into the old well on the abandoned portion of the estate, the one that had been sealed years before, but which Blackwell knew could still be accessed. The inquest found Eleanor's death accidental, found no evidence of violence, no reason to look further. And Thomas simply disappeared. Another young man who had perhaps decided life elsewhere offered more than struggling poverty in England could provide. Holmes had been listening with complete attention, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Now he spoke, his question carefully phrased. "And you knew all this, yet said nothing." "I suspected much, but knew little with certainty, not at first. Sir Richard was destroyed by Eleanor's death, retreated into complete isolation. He dismissed most of the staff, kept only a few of us who had served the family longest. And Blackwell stayed, playing the devoted secretary, helping manage Sir Richard's affairs, while slowly positioning himself to inherit everything. But Sir Richard, broken though he was not entirely blind. He began to have doubts, to ask questions, to notice inconsistencies in Blackwell's accounts of that night. A log shifted in the fire, settling deeper into the grate, with a sound like a long sigh. The shadows rearranged themselves accordingly, finding new positions on the walls, new shapes to assume. Margaret poured more tea, the pot growing lighter now, nearly empty, and I noticed her hands were steadier now that the worst of the story had been told. One night, perhaps 6 months after Eleanor's death, Sir Richard came to me. He had found letters, correspondence between Blackwell and certain unsavoury associates, suggesting debts and desperations I had never suspected. He told me he believed Blackwell had murdered Eleanor, though he could not prove it, and feared scandal should he make public accusations without evidence. He asked me to help him investigate quietly, to watch Blackwell, to gather proof if proof existed. "And did you find it?" I asked, leaning forward. We were close, so close, but Blackwell sensed danger. One morning we woke to find him gone, fled to the continent with a substantial sum from Sir Richard's accounts. Enough to confirm guilt, but not enough to prove murder. Sir Richard reported the theft to authorities, but said nothing of his suspicions regarding Eleanor's death. The scandal, he said, would serve no purpose now. It would not bring her back. It would only sully her memory. Sir Richard lived less than a year after that. He spent his remaining time in the rose garden, cultivating white roses exclusively, Madame Hardy and Alba varieties, Eleanor's favourites. He would cut them and take them to her grave himself, every single day, regardless of weather or his own declining health. And before he died, he made me promise to continue his vigil, to ensure that Eleanor's grave would never lack for roses, that she would know, wherever she was, that she had been loved and was still remembered. Holmes rose from his chair, moved to the window, where the last grey light of afternoon struggled against the approaching night, and stood there silent for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only moments. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, translucent, overlaying the darkening garden beyond, where ancient rosebushes slumbered through winter, waiting for spring that might never fully come to this neglected place. When he turned back to face us, his expression held something I rarely saw there. Not triumph at a mystery solved, but a profound sadness at the human capacity for both enduring love and sudden, senseless violence. "You have kept that promise faithfully," he said to Margaret, his tone carrying genuine admiration. "For 20 years, you have ensured those roses appeared on Eleanor's grave, regardless of season, regardless of the personal cost to yourself. Living here alone in this decaying house, maintaining the conservatory while the rest of the estate falls to ruin around you. That is devotion of the highest order, madam. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the recognition, but not seeking praise for what she clearly considered simply duty-honoured. Sir Richard left me a small annuity, just enough to maintain the conservatory and purchase what I could not grow myself. The house I care for as I am able, but my resources are limited, and I am not young. When I am gone, I suppose it will all fall to complete ruin, and the roses will cease, and Eleanor will lie forgotten under her marble angel. But that does not explain the lights, I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity longer. Or the singing. You cannot be responsible for those manifestations as well, surely. A complicated expression crossed Margaret's weathered face, something between pride and sorrow, between satisfaction and regret. She returned to her chair, settling herself with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested such things more than they once had, and folded her hands in her lap, as if preparing to deliver news that might not be well received. I am not alone in my vigil, she said quietly. Though I have maintained it longer than any other, there are those who remember Eleanor still, who knew her and loved her in their own ways. When Sir Richard died, and I found myself the sole keeper of his promise, I wondered how long I could continue. I am not immortal. The day would come when age or illness would prevent me from climbing that hill to the cemetery, from tending the conservatory, from ensuring the roses appeared as they should. The fire had burned down to coals again, glowing red in the gathering darkness, and I rose to add more fuel without being asked, performing the small service as naturally as breathing. The fresh coal hissed and sparked, releasing thin wisps of sulphurous smoke before catching properly, and gradually the flames returned, pushing back shadows that had been growing bold. 6 months ago, Margaret continued, I received a letter. No return address, no signature, but I knew the hand that wrote it. It was from a woman named Catherine Morrison, who had been Eleanor's closest friend in their youth. They had been educated together, shared secrets and dreams as young girls do, and Catherine had been devastated by Eleanor's death. She married shortly after and moved to Scotland, and I had not heard from her in 2 decades. But now she wrote to say she was widowed, her children grown and gone, and she wished to do something to honour Eleanor's memory. She visits the grave, Holmes asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be more complex. She organised others. There was a small group of Eleanor's friends, women now in their middle years, who had never forgotten her. Catherine contacted them, proposed a memorial society of sorts, dedicated to ensuring that Eleanor's story would not be entirely lost to time. They meet quarterly at the cemetery, at midnight on the night of the new moon, to conduct a small ceremony honouring Eleanor's memory. The pieces were assembling themselves in my mind now, forming a picture both strange and touching. A secret society of middle-aged women gathering in darkness to remember a friend dead 20 years. Their devotion taking forms that frightened superstitious villagers into believing in ghosts and hauntings. The lights, Holmes said, and it was not quite a question, more an invitation for Margaret to confirm what he had already deduced. Lanterns fitted with coloured glass, blue and white, carried on poles that allow them to appear to float. Catherine is quite ingenious in such matters. She was always clever with her hands, could create marvellous effects for the theatrical productions they mounted at the academy where they studied. The singing is hers as well. She trained as an opera singer before her marriage, could produce sounds that seemed impossible from a human throat. She composed a melody specifically for these ceremonies, based on a song Eleanor loved, but transformed into something otherworldly. A soft sound from beyond the sitting room door made us all turn. Margaret rose quickly, crossed to the door and opened it, revealing a woman, perhaps in her late 50s, standing in the darkened hallway, dressed in travelling clothes and carrying a small valise. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with iron grey hair and intelligent eyes that assessed Holmes and myself with frank curiosity. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, Margaret," the woman said, her voice cultured and musical, even in ordinary speech. The maid at the inn mentioned that 2 London gentlemen had been asking questions about the cemetery, and I thought perhaps... She trailed off, taking in our presence with an expression that suggested resignation rather than surprise. "This is Catherine Morrison," Margaret said simply, stepping aside to allow the newcomer to enter our small circle of firelight. "It seems, my dear, that our memorial society has attracted rather more attention than we intended." Catherine Morrison set down her valise and removed her gloves with deliberate care, buying herself time to assess the situation, to decide how much to reveal or conceal. When she finally looked directly at Holmes, her expression was defiant rather than apologetic. "We have broken no laws," she stated firmly. "We trespass in the cemetery, perhaps, but we do no damage, disturb nothing, harm no one. We simply wish to ensure that Eleanor is remembered, that her life meant something beyond the tragedy of her death. Is that so terrible a thing?" "Not terrible at all," Holmes assured her, his voice gentle. "Indeed, madam, I find it rather admirable, but you must understand that your activities have caused considerable distress among the locals, generated fears of supernatural manifestations, and brought the church authorities to the point of seeking outside assistance. The Reverend Blackwood is a good man caught in an impossible situation, and the parishioners are genuinely frightened." Catherine crossed to the fire, warming her hands against the cold of her journey, and when she spoke again, her voice carried less defiance and more weariness. "We never intended to frighten anyone. We thought midnight, the new moon, these would ensure we were unseen. We thought our little memorial would pass unnoticed in a cemetery where the dead far outnumber any living witnesses." "The groundskeeper saw you," I pointed out, "and others. Your blue lanterns, your singing, these things are not easily dismissed or forgotten once witnessed." "I know," she said softly. "We have been careless, perhaps. Or perhaps we have been at this so long that we ceased to consider how it might appear to others. It has become ritual, comfort, a way of maintaining connection with someone we loved who was taken far too soon." Margaret had been standing near the doorway, and now she moved to light several oil lamps positioned around the room, driving back the darkness that had been steadily claiming territory. The additional illumination revealed details previously obscured. Photographs on the mantelpiece showing a young woman who could only be Eleanor, beautiful and bright-eyed, frozen forever at 19. A small shelf of books, many of them botanical texts. A needlework sampler that read "Faith, Hope, Love" in faded thread. "There is more you should know," Margaret said, returning to her chair. "About Thomas Garrett, about what became of him. His body was not discovered in the old well where Blackwell disposed of it. That well was sealed, as I said, and no one had reason to open it. But 6 months ago, when workmen came to the estate to assess what repairs might be minimally necessary to prevent total collapse, they found him. The authorities were notified, but with no way to identify the remains after so much time. They simply removed them and provided them to the church for proper Christian burial. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening cold. He is buried at St. Bartholomew's. In the paupers section, Margaret confirmed. Unknown and unmourned, no marker save a simple wooden cross that will rot away in a few years. But I know where he lies, and I visit when I can, place flowers there as well. White roses, though I could not explain why if anyone asked. It seems only right that Eleanor and Thomas should at least rest in the same ground, even if they could not rest together in life. Catherine had moved to examine the photographs on the mantelpiece, picking up one frame and holding it close to the lamplight. She was going to change the world, you know. She had such plans, such dreams. She wanted to establish a botanical academy for women, to prove that female minds were every bit as capable of scientific thought as male ones. She had drawn up proposals, corresponded with universities, begun to gather support. All of that died with her. All that potential simply erased. The evening had fully arrived now, the windows showing nothing but darkness and our own reflections, the world beyond this small warm room seeming very far away and very cold. Holmes had been silent for several minutes, processing all that had been revealed, organizing information, drawing conclusions. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decision made. "I see 3 paths forward," he said, addressing both women with equal seriousness. "The first is that I report everything to the Reverend Blackwood and recommend he put a stop to your midnight ceremonies, perhaps even pursue trespassing charges if you persist. That would end the mystery, but also end your memorial society and cause you both considerable difficulty." Neither woman moved, suspended in that moment between revelation and consequence, waiting to hear what alternatives the great detective might offer beyond exposure and prosecution. The fire burned steadily, indifferent to human drama, transforming coal into heat and light with the same patience it had shown for millennia. While outside, the wind had begun to rise, moaning to rise, moaning softly through gaps in the window frames, carrying with it the promise of more rain before morning. Holmes moved from the window back to his chair, settling himself with that peculiar grace he possessed, and I noticed how the lamplight caught the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair, the lines that years of intense concentration had carved beside his eyes. He was aging, my friend, though his mind remained as sharp as ever, perhaps even sharper, for the experience that time had granted him. "The second path," he continued, his voice measured and thoughtful, "would be for you to simply cease your activities, to abandon your memorial society, and allow Eleanor's grave to return to the quiet obscurity it knew before you began your ceremonies. That would satisfy the church authorities, calm the frightened parishioners, but it would also mean surrendering something that clearly brings you comfort and purpose, a connection to someone you loved maintained across the years." Catherine set down the photograph she had been holding, her fingers lingering on the frame for a moment before releasing it, as if reluctant to break even that tenuous connection with the past. "And the third path?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had little hope it would offer genuine escape from their dilemma. The third path requires honesty, trust, and perhaps a small amount of theatricality, Holmes said, and I detected the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. We tell the Reverend Blackwood the truth, or at least a version of it. We explain that Eleanor Ashworth has living friends who wish to honour her memory through private ceremonies conducted with dignity and respect. We ask his permission to continue these observances openly, perhaps with his blessing, transforming what appears mysterious and frightening into something understandable and even touching. Margaret had been standing near the bookshelf, and now she turned to face Holmes directly, her expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. You believe he would permit such a thing? A vicar allowing midnight gatherings in his churchyard? I believe, Holmes replied carefully, that Reverend Blackwood is a compassionate man who would prefer understanding to superstition, who would rather bless genuine devotion than condemn it out of hand. He is troubled by the distress his parishioners feel, but he is also a man of education and reason. If we present the situation properly, I think he will see the humanity in what you have been doing, even if the methods have been perhaps unconventional. A teacup slipped from Catherine's hand, shattering against the hearth with a sound like a small explosion in the quiet room. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the broken pieces scattered across the stones, then knelt to gather them, her movements mechanical, automatic. I apologize. How clumsy of me. I hardly know what to think. We have been so secretive for so long. The idea of bringing our ceremonies into the light seems almost impossible to imagine. I moved to help her collect the fragments, the china cold and sharp in my fingers, while Margaret fetched a brush and pan from somewhere in the room's shadows. The small domestic crisis seemed to break some tension that had been building, and when we had disposed of the broken cup and returned to our seats, the atmosphere felt somehow lighter, as if the possibility of resolution had become more tangible, more real. There is something else we might do, Holmes said, leaning forward slightly, his fingers steepled in that characteristic pose. Something that might bring you greater peace, while also serving justice, even if only symbolic justice after so many years. Both women looked at him with renewed attention, and I found myself equally curious about what he might propose. Holmes had a gift for seeing solutions where others saw only intractable problems, for finding paths through apparently impassable terrain. You said that Thomas Garrett lies in the paupers section, unmarked save for a rotting wooden cross. He began. What if he were to receive a proper memorial? Nothing grand, nothing that would attract undue attention, but a simple stone bearing his name and dates, perhaps a small inscription acknowledging his life and death. Margaret, you have maintained Eleanor's roses for 20 years. Might you not extend that care to include the young man she loved, the one whose only crime was refusing to abandon her? Margaret's hand rose to her throat, pressing against the hollow there, as if to contain some emotion that threatened to escape. When she spoke, her voice was thick with feeling barely controlled. I had not thought. That is, I placed flowers when I could, but a stone, a permanent memorial. Yes, I think that would be right. I think Eleanor would want that, and Sir Richard too, if he had known. But I have so little money remaining, barely enough to maintain the conservatory and my own modest needs. I believe I can assist with that, Holmes said quietly. I am not without resources, and this seems a worthy use for some small portion of them. a memorial stone is not so costly, and the stonemason who carved the angel for Eleanor's tomb, if he still lives, or if his workshop continues, might be persuaded to create something appropriate for Thomas as well. The wind outside had strengthened, rattling the windows in their frames, and somewhere in the house's upper reaches, something banged repeatedly, a shutter or loose board protesting the gale's assault. The sounds seemed to emphasize our small circle of light and warmth, this room holding back the darkness and weather through nothing more than old walls and older habits of maintenance and care. "I should tell you the rest," Catherine said suddenly, as if reaching some internal decision, "about why we began the ceremonies now, after so long. It was not merely nostalgia or the convenience of my widowhood, though both played their parts. 6 months ago, I received a letter from Paris. It was from a man claiming to be Cornelius Blackwell's son, though he had taken his mother's name and wanted nothing to do with his father's legacy. He wrote to say that his father had died, and in the final months of illness had confessed to him what he had done, the murders he had committed, the lives he had destroyed." She paused, drew a shaky breath, and continued. The son found this confession deeply troubling. He had not known his father well, having been raised primarily by his mother in France, but he felt compelled to somehow acknowledge the wrong that had been done, even if he could not make restitution. He included with his letter a substantial sum of money, asking that it be used to honor Eleanor's memory in some way. It was that gift that allowed us to expand our small private remembrances into something more elaborate, to purchase the materials for the lanterns, to gather others who had known Eleanor and include them in our ceremonies. Holmes's expression had grown very still, very focused. "Do you still have this letter? The son's name and address?" "I do, though I am not certain what use it might serve." The man made clear he wished no contact beyond that single correspondence, wanted only to unburden himself of his father's guilt by proxy. "Nevertheless, I should very much like to see it, if you would permit." Catherine rose and retrieved her valise from where she had set it near the door, extracting from it a leather portfolio that she opened carefully, producing a folded letter written on expensive paper in an educated hand. Holmes took it, moved to where the lamplight was strongest, and read with that intense concentration that characterized his examination of evidence. Several minutes passed while he studied not just the words, but the paper itself, the ink, the handwriting, processing information invisible to ordinary observation. "This is genuine," he pronounced finally. "The watermark dates to this year. The ink is French manufacture. The handwriting shows no signs of forgery or artificial aging. More than that, there are certain details here that only someone with intimate knowledge of Blackwell and his crimes would know. Details that were never made public. This letter represents, if not a legal confession, at least a moral acknowledgement of guilt that has gone unpunished for 2 decades." He folded the letter carefully and returned it to Catherine, then stood and began to pace, that restless energy that possessed him when solutions began to crystallize from chaos. "Here is what I propose. Tomorrow, Watson and I shall call upon Reverend Blackwood. We shall explain that we have discovered the source of the mysterious manifestations, that they are the work of living people rather than supernatural forces, and that these people seek only to honor the memory of someone they loved. We shall request his permission for your memorial society to continue its ceremonies, perhaps with minor modifications to reduce the fear they generate among his parishioners. "What sort of modifications?" Margaret asked, practical even in hope. Perhaps the ceremonies might be conducted by candlelight rather than the floating lanterns, which have proven particularly frightening. Perhaps the singing might be hymns rather than that otherworldly melody, beautiful though it is. Small concessions that preserve the essential nature of your memorial while removing the elements that most disturb observers. He paused in his pacing, turning to face both women directly. "I believe the Reverend will agree, particularly if I explain the fuller context, the tragedy that underlies your devotion. He is a man of genuine faith, and genuine faith understands that love persists beyond death, that loyalty honors both the living and the dead." The grandfather clock, standing in the corner, which I had not previously noticed, chimed the hour with soft, musical notes. 8 sonorous sounds, marking the evening's progression toward night proper. The wind continued its assault on the old house, but within this room, surrounded by Eleanor's photographs and Margaret's patient devotion, there existed a peace that weather could not disturb, a sense that healing, however long delayed, might finally be approaching. "There is one thing more I should mention," Margaret said, rising to add coal to the fire once again, the flames having burned low during our long conversation. "The cousin who inherited the estate, the one who has never visited and cares nothing for the Ashworth legacy, he has decided to sell the property. I received notice 3 weeks ago. The house, the grounds, everything will be auctioned in the spring. After that, I do not know what will become of the conservatory, or the roses, or my ability to maintain the promise I made to Sir Richard." The news settled over us like a shroud, threatening to undo all the hope that had been building. Holmes resumed his pacing, faster now, his mind attacking this new problem with renewed vigour. Catherine moved to stand beside Margaret, placing a comforting hand on the older woman's shoulder, and in that simple gesture I saw the strength of their bond, forged in shared loss and maintained through shared devotion. "Then we must ensure," Holmes said decisively, "that whoever purchases this estate understands its history and agrees to preserve at least the conservatory and rose garden. That will require negotiation, perhaps leverage of some kind, but it is not impossible. Watson, tomorrow after we speak with the Reverend, we shall need to make inquiries about the auction, about who might be interested in purchasing the property." Morning arrived with unexpected clarity, the storms of previous days having finally exhausted themselves, leaving behind a sky washed clean and pale as porcelain. Sunlight, tea, sunlight, that rarest of winter commodities in London, streamed through the windows of Baker Street with almost aggressive cheerfulness, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden columns and making our familiar rooms feel strange and new, as if we were seeing them for the first time. Holmes was already awake when I emerged from my chamber, had perhaps never slept at all, and stood at the window with his coffee cup watching the street below, where the city conducted its morning business with renewed energy, as if the clear weather had infused even the most mundane transactions with fresh possibility. "A propitious day for resolution, Watson," he greeted me without turning from the window. "I have been considering our approach to the Reverend, the precise words we must use to convey the situation's complexity, while emphasizing its fundamental simplicity. We are dealing with love, after all, love that has persisted for 20 years across the boundary that separates living from dead, Surely a man of faith can understand and honour such devotion. We breakfasted quickly, neither of us particularly hungry, but both aware of the need for sustenance before the day's activities. Mrs. Hudson had outdone herself, providing eggs perfectly cooked, bacon crisp and fragrant, toast with fresh butter and a marmalade, and coffee so strong it seemed to banish the last remnants of fatigue from my system. She bustled about as we ate, tidying things that did not require tidying, her maternal instincts clearly sensing that something of importance was afoot, though she asked no questions and offered no commentary beyond ensuring our cups remained filled. By 10 o'clock, we were again on the familiar train to Highgate, the journey now routine, the stations passing in expected sequence. But today, the landscape looked different beneath clear skies. The winter sun transforming everything, making even the industrial stretches between city and suburb appear almost beautiful, their ugliness softened by golden light and long shadows. Other passengers filled the carriage, travelling to their own destinations for their own purposes, and I found myself wondering how many of them carried secrets, how many harboured griefs or maintained vigils known only to themselves and perhaps to God. St. Bartholomew's Church looked entirely different in sunlight, its ancient stones warm rather than forbidding, its cemetery spreading peacefully rather than ominously around it. The monuments that had seemed so gothic and mysterious by moonlight appeared almost friendly now, the angels protective rather than ominous, the crosses marking rest rather than ending. We found Reverend Blackwood in his study, a comfortable room lined with theological texts and smelling pleasantly of pipe tobacco and old leather, and he received us with evident relief mixed with apprehension. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I confess I have been anxiously awaiting your return. Have you discovered the source of our mysterious manifestations? He gestured us to chairs facing his desk, which was covered with papers and open books, evidence of a morning spent in scholarly pursuit, or perhaps sermon preparation. Holmes settled himself, declining the offered tea with a polite gesture, and began to speak. He told the story with remarkable sensitivity, presenting facts without judgment, acknowledging both the unconventional nature of the Memorial Society's activities and the genuine devotion that motivated them. He spoke of Eleanor Ashworth's tragic death, of Margaret's faithful promise-keeping, of Catherine Morrison's organisational efforts to ensure that a young woman's life would not be entirely forgotten. He mentioned Thomas Garrett only briefly, noting that his story intersected with Eleanor's, but not revealing the full horror of double murder and concealment. The Reverend listened without interruption, his expression moving through surprise, understanding, sadness, and finally, something that might have been admiration. When Holmes finished, silence filled the study, broken only by the ticking of a desk clock and the distant sound of the church bell marking the half-hour. A pigeon landed on the windowsill outside, cooed softly to itself, then departed in a flutter of grey wings. "I see," the Reverend said finally, removing his spectacles and cleaning them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to give him time to organise his thoughts. "So, we have no ghosts, no supernatural disturbances, merely living women honouring their friend's memory in ways that unfortunately frightened my parishioners. I confess I am relieved, though also somewhat chagrined. I should have considered such possibilities before troubling you with what amounts to, well, a misunderstanding." "Not at all," Holmes assured him. The circumstances were genuinely mysterious, and your concern for your parishioners' well-being was entirely appropriate. But now we must consider how to proceed. These women wish to continue their memorial observances, and I believe they should be permitted to do so, with your blessing if possible. The Reverend replaced his spectacles, his expression thoughtful. I agree, though I think some modifications to their methods might be advisable. Midnight ceremonies with strange lights will always generate fear, however innocent their intent. But perhaps if they were to visit at dusk, or even in daylight during their quarterly gatherings, using candles instead of those floating lanterns, conducting themselves openly rather than secretly, then the mystery dissolves and becomes simply what it is: devotion made visible. A weight I had not realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. Holmes nodded, satisfaction evident in his features, and I understood that this was precisely the outcome he had hoped to achieve, the path forward that honoured both truth and compassion. There is another matter, Holmes continued, and proceeded to explain about Thomas Garrett, about the unmarked grave, and the proposal for a memorial stone. The Reverend listened carefully, then stood and moved to his window, looking out over the cemetery where sunlight illuminated hundreds of monuments, each one marking a life lived and ended, a story complete or interrupted. I knew that an unidentified body had been discovered on the Ashworth estate and brought here for burial, he said quietly. I conducted the service myself, committed him to the earth with prayers for the soul of one whose name was unknown, but whose worth to God was certain. If this young man was Thomas Garrett, if he died as you suggest he might have, then yes, a memorial stone is more than appropriate. It is necessary. The Church maintains a fund for such purposes, for those who die without means or family, to provide proper remembrance. I shall ensure a stone is commissioned immediately. The morning continued with discussion of practical details, of permissions and arrangements, of letters to be written and meetings to be held. Catherine Morrison arrived near noon, having received a message from Margaret summoning her to the church, and her relief at learning the Reverend's response was palpable. She wept quietly, openly, tears of gratitude and release flowing unchecked, while the Reverend offered her his handkerchief and spoke gently of grace and understanding. By early afternoon, we had accomplished what we set out to achieve. The mystery was explained, permissions were granted, arrangements were made. But one significant question remained unanswered. What would become of Margaret and her conservatory when the estate was sold in spring? Holmes had been making discreet inquiries throughout the morning, and as we prepared to depart, he drew me aside, his expression conveying barely contained satisfaction. I have discovered something most interesting, Watson. The cousin selling the estate has received only one serious inquiry about purchase, from a businessman interested in converting the house into a private hospital or convalescent home. The property's isolation and substantial grounds make it ideal for such purpose. That would surely mean the conservatory's destruction, I said, feeling dismay at how close we had come to complete resolution, only to have this final obstacle remain. Perhaps not, Holmes replied, with that particular smile that suggested he had been several moves ahead all along. I have taken the liberty of contacting this potential buyer, a Mr. James Whitmore, explaining the conservatory's significance and suggesting that its preservation might actually enhance the property's value, providing patients with beautiful gardens to aid their recovery. I may have also mentioned that such thoughtfulness would generate favourable publicity for his new establishment, and that I personally know several prominent physicians who might recommend his facility should it demonstrate such sensitivity to beauty and healing. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when we finally left Highgate, the short winter day already surrendering to evening's approach. We travelled not directly back to London, but first to the Ashworth estate, where we found Margaret in her conservatory, tending her roses as she had done for 20 years, her capable hands moving among the white blooms with practised gentleness. We brought her the news of all that had been arranged, watched her face transform as hope replaced resignation, as the burden of decades began finally to lighten. "I never thought," she said, her voice breaking, "I never imagined that anyone would care, that anyone would understand. I was prepared to continue alone until I could continue no longer, and then to simply stop, to let it all end. But now you tell me that Eleanor's friends may visit openly, that Thomas will have a proper stone, that perhaps even this house and these roses might survive beyond my own passing. It is more than I dared hope for." The conservatory was warm, humid, filled with the heavy perfume of roses blooming impossibly in December, and through its glass walls we could see the abandoned garden beyond, waiting for spring or perhaps for someone to finally reclaim it from wilderness. Sunlight slanted through the glass at steep angles, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, making the white roses glow as if lit from within. We departed as dusk began to settle, walking back through the overgrown garden towards the gates, and I noticed how the evening light transformed everything, how shadows stretched long and mysterious across the unkempt lawns, how the old house seemed almost beautiful in the forgiving illumination of day's end. At the gate, we paused and looked back, seeing Margaret's silhouette moving in the conservatory, a faithful keeper of promises, a tender of memory's garden. The journey back to Baker Street felt like awakening from a dream, that peculiar sensation of returning to ordinary life after immersion in something deeper, stranger, more significant. London received us with its usual indifference, its millions of stories continuing in parallel, never touching, each one complete unto itself. We climbed the 17 steps to our rooms, found the fire burning and tea waiting, and settled into our familiar chairs with the satisfaction of difficult work completed well. "An unusual case," I remarked, cradling my teacup and watching flames dance in the grate. "One that required no arrests, uncovered no criminals to face justice, solved no crime that could be prosecuted. Yet perhaps our most important case," Holmes replied softly. "We have given resolution to grief, permission to memory, hope to devotion. We have honoured love that persisted across 2 decades and a grave. Tell me, Watson, what criminal we have ever captured has mattered as much as that? If you have found peace in this story, if it has carried you gently towards sleep, then I hope you will take a moment to subscribe, to leave a like, to let me know that these tales of mystery and memory, of Gothic nights and Victorian secrets, bring you the rest you seek. And if you wish to see more stories like this, more gentle mysteries designed to ease you into dreams, then your support means everything. Now, as our story closes and the candle burns low, as Baker Street settles into its own rest and Eleanor Ashworth's marble angel stands eternal vigil beneath winter stars, I wish you good night. May your dreams be peaceful, may your rest be deep, And may you always remember that love, true love, persists beyond all obstacles, beyond time itself, beyond even that final boundary we all must someday cross. The mystery of the moonlit cemetery is solved, but the greater mystery, the one that has no solution and needs none, continues eternally. Why we love, why we remember, why we keep faith with those who have gone before us into that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well, and dream of white roses blooming impossibly in winter, of promises kept faithfully across the turning years, of mysteries both solved and eternal, and of the quiet peace that comes when understanding finally arrives, gentle as snow falling on ancient stones, soft as whispered prayers in darkened churches, certain as morning following even the longest night.